As a young South African growing up in what is now 22 years of a democratic South Africa, and being raised by a single mother who's actually an educator, I've learned two important things about life. One, I've learned to master my handwriting. And secondly, that has also assisted me in keeping in touch with the real realities of what South Africans, and Africans in particular, go through on a day-to-day basis, more specifically young people. I say this because a lot of the time when my mother would come back from work, in as much as I might come from a background which might be now referred to as a middle-class South African, but every day whenever she would come back to work, she'd always remind me of the real realities that she experiences with South African youth and South African learners. One day she came back home from work and told me about a story. She seemed very puzzled and very anxious. And she sat me down like any other parent would do and said, "Ndumiso, you need to appreciate everything that you have in your life." And I was like, yeah, of course you would say that, like any other parent would say that, you know? And this time, whilst I was in that manner, she was quite serious. And she said, "I saw something very shocking today in the classroom." And I said, "Mama, what was that?" And she said, "There is a learner in my classroom that actually vomited today in class. It was a very messy situation." And I was like, yo, okay. Why did she vomit? And she says, when I asked her why she vomited, she had actually cited that the night before, she had eaten pap and cooking oil for supper, hence vomiting the following day. And so this one story that my mother came home from work telling me about, it made me question a lot of things. It made me question, why is the world that we live in shaped the way it is? What informs the society that we live in? Why is it that we can live in a society where extreme poverty can live alongside extreme wealth? What is this thing? Is it a tool? Is it a driver that influences the kind of society and the kind of world that we live in today? So I began to undergo a journey of questioning and probing and what my role in all of this is. And I came across a story in a book called Frontiers by an author called Mustard. And this one story in this particular book was the first step in me actually understanding what shapes the world that we live in today, particularly as a young person who's passionate about my country, who loves my people, who loves this continent, and wants to shape the world in order for it to be the world that we reimagine and the world that we all aspire to live in. And so in this particular story, particularly, I guess, as a young African man, a lot of us do not know a lot really about our history. And this one book actually opened doors in terms of my insight with regards to that. So there was a Portuguese admiral who had actually conquered the East in India, etc., and he was recalled by his king in Portugal to come back, and he was going to be awarded with the greatest honor of being the greatest admiral in Portuguese history. So after having conquering the East, they came down, and of course, naturally, they stopped by the Cape. And they came across an encounter with the Khoisan people. And of course, they wanted to stop there, have refreshments, water, meat, etc. And back in those days, they used to trade and barter, isn't it? Upon that encounter, this Portuguese admiral asked themselves, but hey, listen, I actually conquered the East, so I don't necessarily have to pay these people for this water and this meat. And the Khoisan people did not take lightly of that. And so a battle began. And so a lot of us would not know this about the Khoisan people and their military arms. They actually used to use kettle in battle. And what they used to do, they used to sharpen their horns and use them to charge ahead whenever they're in battle with another nation or another tribe, etc. And so the battle began. Portuguese people and the Khoisan people. The cattle charged with the horns facing, and it took people out. Whilst the Khoisan people had spears, sharp spears, and they throw them to the back, and it would get to the rest of the guys in that particular army. It is said in Portuguese archives today that that was the biggest loss of any Portuguese army, because that was the crème de la crème, the cream of Portuguese society. Now, the reality that most of us do not know the story is part of the problem as to what informs us knowing some of the history that has happened previously. Why do we know certain parts of history and not others? Who decides that you can have this and you can't have that, you can know this and you cannot have that? What is this thing? So naturally, as a young person, I'm very inquisitive. And more so in the 21st century, Google is your friend. So I went on to probe. So why is the world that we live in the way it is? What shapes this world? And what is it that we can identify so that we ourselves can actually know what is it that is shaping the world that we live in? In the continent of Africa, our beloved continent, and the world over, we have a big challenge of terrorism attacks in many of our nations. Boko Haram, for instance, is one clear example. 276 of our girls, they had abducted because of a particular idea or ideology that they're of the belief of. And what is particularly fascinating to me is that you would think that, well, the assumption would be that a lot of people would not have this frame of mind that terrorists actually have the world over. But Boko Haram has moved from having 5,000 active fighters to over 50,000, and they are growing in numbers on a day-to-day basis. Now, that for me, it baffles my mind. How is it possible that in the world that we live in, and what is this thing that is shaping the world that we live in, but you would think that something like terrorist groups would not exist? Because why would you wake up one day and say, actually, this is an individual that I want to harm because I'm off the view? So what informs this thinking or this idea that people have? Then we have our own father of the nation, Utatu Nelson Mandela. Now, this man is the reason why we can all sit here this afternoon and have an exchange and a robust exchange of ideas and learn from one another and live in a democratic society that we live in today. Himself and other vanguards, political movements, and other leaders such as Walter Sisulu, Steve Biko, Helen Suzman, and the rest of it, they actually mobilized the international society around a united, democratic, non-sexist, non-racial South Africa. Now, in the same light, Boko Haram is able to lobby, influence people around an idea that has the worst intention and commits the worst atrocities against humankind. And on the flip side, you have individuals who are of the view of a united, of a prosperous world, and us living together and coexisting in peace. Why is it both of these extremes have so much influence? And it's an idea that resonates with a lot of people on both ends. Why can it not be skewed on the positive end to say we want a peaceful world that we can all coexist and live in? Why does this opposite end exist? And I actually found that there's one attribute that is consistent in both extremes, and that is influence. It's influence. So why is bad leadership actually good? Bad leadership is actually good because it teaches us that leadership itself is not inherently good. So we would have the assumption that by virtue of being a leader, of course, your motives ought to be good. They ought to be noble. But it is very possible for an individual who has the worst intentions for people, even to commit the worst atrocities against humankind, to be a great leader. It is equally possible for an individual who has the most noble intentions for people, noble intentions for the world over, to equally be a great leader. And so when we begin to understand, as I began to probe further, influence, the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something, or the effect itself. Upon understanding that, I then asked, but how do people then achieve or attain this kind of influence on people? If I, as Ndumiso here today, decide, listen, I want to lobby and mobilize people for a particular noble cause, how do I achieve that? If I, as Ndumiso, want to mobilize or lobby people for a particular cause that is going to do harm to other people, how do I do that? And ladies and gentlemen, what I actually found is that it's actually done through the battle of ideas. You see, influence is achieved through ideas. And in this example specifically, one individual would have the view that in order to achieve economic growth at a larger scale would have to happen, and then it will trickle down for all of us to be moderately prosperous. Whereas on the other hand, the idea is that when you have working families and working class who have sufficient income to purchase a car, to buy a fridge, to access higher education, that is when you're able to achieve economic growth, a bottom-up approach. So there are always two ends of the stick. There are always two ends of an idea, but the root of it all is influence. Even from a simple situation as in your own home, trying to influence or persuade your sibling over which channel to actually watch and who should actually have the remote. That in itself, it's applicable in every single area of our lives. Like, listen, I need to watch MTV Base at 7 o'clock. No, but you can't. I'll give you a chocolate. All right, let's go. That's influence on the smallest of scale. So leadership is influence that is achieved through the battle of ideas. So what, Ndumiso? So what? We know that there are two ends of the stick. We know that people achieve this kind of impact and influence through influence and the battle of ideas. But so what? We can all live our lives. I mean, we are okay and everything is going well. Why do we need to be concerned about this notion of how the world is shaped and what informs the world that we live in today where, for example, as we cited earlier, extreme wealth can live alongside extreme poverty? Why can't we all have the same access to opportunity, the same access to achieving our goals and aspirations? It's because there are certain ideas that have been leveraged over another. And a lot of the time we think that you can beat an idea, such as terrorism, through the barrel of the gun. But that's not how it works. An existing idea, or a predominant idea, can only be beaten by an even greater idea. That is how you achieve influence. And as a young person in South Africa, I'm particularly concerned because in South Africa today, half of our population are young people under the age of 25. So half of South Africa's population are people my age below. 61% of South Africa's population are people under the age of 35. What does that mean? It's even worse in the continent of Africa. While the rest of the developed world is getting older and older, and they are suffering from a midlife old crisis, our youth is getting younger and younger, and our population is getting younger and younger. And at the rate at which things are changing, how are we best prepared as young people to navigate the challenges of the future? Understanding that the world is shaped through influence and through the influence of particular ideas. How do we then use this and apply it in our day-to-day lives so that we can shape the tomorrow that we want to live in? Reimagine the world that we want to live in. Reimagine the society that we want to see for ourselves and our kids' kids, etc., etc. And increasingly, we live in a world that is referred to as VUCA, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I'll show you why, as young people live in a VUCA world. Kodak. Anybody remember Kodak? The Kodak story is a beautiful example. The year 2000, from 2001 to 2005, that is a graph of the sales of Kodak. They were leading company in digital photography. But in 2005, Nokia introduced a Nokia 7510, I believe. And what they did is that they put a small VGA camera. Remember those small VGA cameras that aren't so clear? That introduction of that small camera behind a phone led to the total extinguishment of Kodak being a leader in digital photography. But you see, they weren't receptive to learning. They weren't receptive to the changing ideas, which is the world that we as young people live in today, and we need to be prepared for it, and understanding that the world is shaped through influence that is achieved through ideas, and you do that by beating an existing idea with an even greater idea. It's evident in our personal lives, it's evident even in business. Within the next 5 years, ladies and gentlemen, our population on the continent, half of the working population will be under 25. So half of the working population in the next 5 years on the African continent will be young people who are actually my younger brother's age, who's 21 right now. I'm sure I'll be, let's not go there. Fees must fall is another idea. Having served in the student body myself, this was a notion that we believed that the greatest equalizer for poverty and inequality might not necessarily be income, but education is the greatest equalizer. Then after comes technology. And this is a movement that I never thought that I'll see actually or imagine come to life. But what the world is saying is that the more you give opportunity for people to have access to higher education, the long-term benefits of it are great. So now the premise or the argument of young people is to say, what is the opportunity cost? Do we decide to fund certain programs, or do we decide to move with free education for academically deserving and needy students and reap the long-term benefits in future? How then do we also bridge the gap between the two divides that exist in South Africa? Extreme wealth next to extreme poverty. Technology education being the greatest equalizer. How do we address and shape the world that we want to see through our ideas and achieving that through influence? More and more young people fall under what is referred to as the NEET tragedy, N-E-E-T, not in employment, education, or training. And that is why we find a lot of young people, a lot of unemployed young people, find themselves in a life of crime, in a life of addiction, and I guess informing some of the socioeconomic challenges that we face today. How do we then, as young people, prepare for the future? How do we then shape the future that we want to see? How then do we reimagine the world that we want to live in? How then do we begin to change the life of young Ndumiso there who's pushing that motorbike with his friends in Alexandra? And compared to Ndumiso who's perhaps in Sandton, who has opportunities the world over. But both of the Ndumisos are equal in dignity in the eyes of God. How do we do that? You answer it. Thank you.